November 26, 1974, West Belfast. Thomas Spence was 11 years old. His best friend, John Rogers, was 13. They were both standing at a bus stop on the Falls Road, waiting for a school bus. A neighbor saw them there. They were talking, the way boys do. Normal morning, normal kids. They never arrived at school. No one ever saw them again. When Thomas's mother reported him missing, police took a statement and filed it away. No search, no press conference, no appeal for witnesses. A small article appeared in a local newspaper 4 days later, not on the front page, not with photographs, a few column inches on page 5. And then, silence. But here's what makes this case different from any ordinary missing persons file. Thomas and John weren't the first boys to vanish from the streets of Belfast. And they weren't the last. 5 years earlier, in September 1969, 2 more young boys had disappeared from the same city. David Leckey, 11, and Jonathan Aven, 14, went missing from East Belfast, just over a mile from where Thomas and John would vanish 5 years later. They were believed to have gone missing together. Like Thomas and John, they were never found. And then there was Brian McDermott. Brian was 11 years old. On September 2, 1973, he was last seen in Ormeau Park. His remains were found shortly afterward in a Hessian sack in the River Lagan. He had been mutilated. The remains were charred. Someone had tried to burn them. A forensic psychologist who later reviewed the case described it as one of the most brutal, gruesome murders in the history of Northern Ireland. Brian's older brother, William, 16 at the time, confessed to the murder, but later said the confession was coerced. He has maintained his innocence ever since. The real killer was never identified. 5 boys, 5 miles, 5 years, not one arrest, not one conviction. Not one body returned to its family. For decades, these cases were treated as isolated incidents. The families called police and were put on hold. They were told there was nothing to investigate. They were told their sons were probably runaways. They were told, effectively, to stop asking. Belfast in the early 1970s was a city at war with itself. The Troubles, the brutal sectarian conflict between Republican and Loyalist factions, with the British Army deployed on the streets, dominated every headline, every police resource, every political conversation. Children disappearing got buried under everything else. As one journalist put it at the time, if he'd gone to his editor with a story about 2 missing boys, he'd have been told there were better things to cover. But that explanation only goes so far. Because when investigative journalists and criminologists began systematically reviewing the cases decades later, what they found wasn't just institutional neglect. What they found looked like something deliberate. The police files on Thomas and John were almost empty. Not just thin, almost non-existent. No witness statements from the school, no canvassing of the bus route, no record of efforts to trace the boys' movements after the bus stop. A retired senior detective who reviewed the case in the early 2000s told investigators he was shocked by how little was in the file. For 2 boys who had been missing for weeks, there was almost nothing to work with. Requests to the Police Service of Northern Ireland for information about the cases were met with refusals and incorrect dates. When investigators asked for the locations where the boys were last seen, the request was denied. They waited 9 months for an interview. It never came. And then came the documents. In the course of researching the disappearances, investigators discovered something that connected all 5 cases to something far darker, a scandal that had been suppressed at the highest levels of the British government for decades. Kincora Boys Home was a residential care facility in East Belfast. Between the 1960s and 1980s, it was the site of systematic sexual abuse of the boys placed in its care. The abuse was orchestrated by staff members. It was known to senior figures in Loyalist paramilitary circles, and according to multiple intelligence sources and declassified documents, it was known to MI5, who chose to do nothing because the abusers were intelligence assets. The men running Kincora were being used by British intelligence as informants. Their usefulness to the state outweighed, in someone's calculation, the ongoing abuse of the children in their care. MI5 not only failed to stop the abuse, according to investigators, they actively prevented police from investigating it. When an internal inquiry was eventually launched years later, MI5 refused to attend. They refused to provide documents. They refused to cooperate in any meaningful way, and multiple files relating to Kincora and the period in question were destroyed. When investigators cross-referenced the geography of the missing boys' cases with the geography of the Kincora network, the overlap was striking. At least 3 of the 5 missing boys attended schools or programs associated with children who had learning difficulties, making them more vulnerable, more isolated, more easily targeted. Several had been playing truant from school in the days before they disappeared. A forensic psychologist who reviewed all 5 cases independently concluded, this was almost certainly the work of a predator, or predators, operating in the same network, over the same area, across the same period of time. The probability that 5 boys vanished from a 5-mile radius over 5 years without any connection was, in his assessment, essentially 0. The families had been saying this for 50 years. No one with the power to act had listened. In 2023, a documentary filmmaker named Des Henderson spent 5 years investigating the cases. What he and his team uncovered, the MI5 connection, the Kincora overlap, the destroyed files, the misleading archive footage of a mother being told her son had been sighted alive when no such sighting was verified, was enough for Belfast's leading human rights law firm to announce legal proceedings against the British state. KRW Law filed for a conjoined inquest on all 5 cases. They filed complaints with the police ombudsman over the failure to treat the disappearances as connected murder inquiries, and they issued high court civil proceedings against the state for misfeasance, negligence, and conspiracy. In their statement, the lawyers wrote, "There is something inherently wrong with a justice system that places over-reliance on the far-reaching work of investigative journalists before a meaningful inquiry can look at why suspects were protected from prosecution. All of the main suspected perpetrators are now dead. They died without ever facing justice. They died while the families of Thomas, John, David, Jonathan, and Brian continued to wait. 50 years of waiting. The files were destroyed. The agents refused to testify. The inquiry never happened. And 5 boys who stood at bus stops and played in parks on ordinary September mornings were left in unmarked graves, in riverbeds, in places their mothers will never know. The state thought it had buried this story along with the children. It was wrong. If this case stayed with you, please subscribe to Verdict Files. We cover new cases every week, and your support helps us keep telling these stories. Hit the like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and share this video with someone who follows true crime. Every share brings more attention to cases that deserve it. We'll see you in the next case.